Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a rare sequel from an author not known for them, and in this case, to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his most famous work. If you enjoy this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. And don't forget to join us over on Twitch for our readings Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. And now, on to the story. Chapter 11. Winter arrived with the month of June, which is the December of the northern zones, and the great business was the making of warm and solid clothing. The musmons in the corral had been stripped of their wool, and this precious textile material was now to be transformed into stuff. Of course, Cyrus Harding, having at his disposal neither carders, combers, polishers, stretchers, twisters, mule jenny, nor self-acting machine to spin the wool, nor loom to weave it, was obliged to proceed in a simpler way, so as to do without spinning and weaving. And indeed he proposed to make use of the property which the filaments of wool possess when subjected to a powerful pressure of mixing together, and of manufacture by this simple process the material called felt. This felt could then be obtained by a simple operation which, if it diminished the flexibility of the stuff, increased its power of retaining heat in proportion. Now the wool furnished by the musmons was composed of very short hairs, and was in a good condition to be felted. The engineer, aided by his companions, including Pencroft, who was once more obliged to leave his boat, commenced the preliminary operations, the subject of which was to rid the wool of that fat and oily substance with which it is impregnated, and which is called grease. This cleaning was done in vats filled with water, which was maintained at the temperature of 70 degrees, and in which the wool was soaked for 24 hours. It was then thoroughly washed in baths of soda, and when sufficiently dried by pressure, it was in a state to be compressed, that is to say, to produce a solid material. Rough, no doubt, and such as would have no value in a manufacturing center of Europe or America, but which would be highly esteemed in the Lincoln Island markets. This sort of material must have been known from the most ancient times, and in fact the first woolen stuffs were manufactured by the process which Harding was now about to employ. Where Harding's engineering qualifications now came into play was in the construction of the machine for pressing the wool, for he knew how to turn ingeniously to profit the mechanical force, hitherto unused, which the waterfall on the beach possessed to move a fulling mill. Nothing could be more rudimentary. The wool was placed in troughs, and upon it fell in turns heavy wooden mallets. Such was the machine in question, and such it had been for centuries, until the time when the mallets were replaced by cylinders of compression, and the material was no longer subjected to beating, but to regular rolling. The operation, ably directed by Cyrus Harding, was a complete success. The wool, previously impregnated with a solution of soap, intended on the one hand to facilitate the interlacing, the compression, and the softening of the wool, and on the other to prevent its diminution by the beating, issued from the mill in the shape of thick felt cloth. The roughness with which the staple of wool is naturally filled were so thoroughly entangled and interlaced together that a material was formed equally suitable either for garments or bedclothes. It was certainly neither merino, muslin, cashmere, rep, satin, alpaca, cloth, nor flannel. It was Lincolnian felt, and Lincoln Island possessed yet another manufacture. The colonists had now warm garments and thick bedclothes, and they could without fear await the approach of the winter of 1866 to 67. The severe cold began to be felt about the 20th of June, and to his great regret, Pencroft was obliged to suspend his boat building, which he hoped to finish in time for next spring. The sailor's great idea was to make a voyage of discovery to Tabor Island, although Harding could not approve of a voyage simply for curiosity's sake, for there was evidently nothing to be found on this desert and almost arid rock. A voyage of 150 miles in a comparatively small vessel over unknown seas could not but cause him some anxiety. Suppose that their vessel, once out at sea, should be unable to reach Tabor Island, and could not return to Lincoln Island, what would become of her in the midst of the Pacific, so fruitful of disasters? Harding often talked over this project with Pencroft, and he found him strangely bent upon undertaking this voyage, for which determination he himself could give no sufficient reason. "Now," said the engineer one day to him, "I must observe, my friend, that after having said so much in praise of Lincoln Island, after having spoken so often of the sorrow you would feel if you were obliged to forsake it, you are the first to wish to leave it." "Only to leave it for a few days," replied Pencroft. "Only for a few days, Captain. Time to go and come back and see what that islet is like." "But it is not nearly as good as Lincoln Island." "I know that beforehand." "Then why venture there?" "To know what is going on in Tabor Island." "But nothing is going on there. Nothing could happen there." "Who knows? And if you are caught in a hurricane?" "There is no fear of that in the fine season," replied Pencroft. "But, Captain, as we must provide against everything, I shall ask your permission to take Herbert only with me on this voyage." "Pencroft," replied the engineer, placing his hand on the sailor's shoulder, "if any misfortune happens to you or to this lad, who chance has made our child, do you think we could ever cease to blame ourselves?" "Captain Harding," replied Pencroft with unshaken confidence, "we shall not cause you that sorrow. Besides, we will speak further of this voyage when the time comes to make it, and I fancy when you have seen our tight-rigged little craft, when you have observed how she behaves at sea, when we sail round our island, for we will do so together, I fancy, I say, that you will no longer hesitate to let me go. I don't conceal from you that your boat will be a masterpiece." "Say our boat, at least, Pencroft," replied the engineer, disarmed for the moment. The conversation ended thus, to be resumed later on, without convincing either the sailor or the engineer. The first snow fell towards the end of the month of June. The corral had previously been largely supplied with stores, so that daily visits to it were not requisite, but it was decided that more than a week should never be allowed to pass without someone going to it. Traps were again set, and the machines manufactured by Harding were tried. The bent whalebones, imprisoned in a case of ice and covered with a thick outer layer of fat, were placed on the border of the forest at a spot where animals usually passed on their way to the lake. To the engineer's great satisfaction, this invention, copied from the Aleutian fishermen, succeeded perfectly. A dozen foxes, a few wild boars, and even a jaguar were taken in this way, the animals being found dead, their stomachs pierced by the unbent bones. An incident must here be related, not only as interesting in itself, but because it was the first attempt made by the colonists to communicate with the rest of mankind. Gideon Spilett had already several times pondered whether to throw into the sea a letter enclosed in a bottle, which currents might perhaps carry to an inhabited coast, or to confide it to pigeons. But how could it be seriously hoped that either pigeons or bottles could cross the distance of 1,200 miles which separated the island from any inhabited land? It would have been pure folly. But on the 30th of June the capture was effected, not without difficulty, of an albatross, which a shot from Herbert's gun had slightly wounded in the foot. It was a magnificent bird, measuring 10 feet from wing to wing, and which could traverse seas as wide as the Pacific. Herbert would have liked to keep this superb bird, as its wound would soon heal, and he thought he could tame it, but Spilett explained to him that they should not neglect this opportunity of attempting to communicate by this messenger with the lands of the Pacific, for if the albatross had come from some inhabited region, there was no doubt but that it would return there so soon as it was set free. Perhaps in his heart Gideon Spilett, in whom the journalist sometimes came to the surface, was not sorry to have the opportunity of sending forth to take its chance an exciting article relating the adventures of the settlers in Lincoln Island. What a success for the authorized report of the New York Herald, and for the number which should contain the article, if it should ever reach the address of its editor, the Honorable James Bennet. Gideon Spilett then wrote out a concise account, which was placed in a strong waterproof bag, with an earnest request to whoever might find it to forward it to the office of the New York Herald. This little bag was fastened to the neck of the albatross, and not to its foot, for these birds are in the habit of resting on the surface of the sea. Then liberty was given to this swift courier of the air, and it was not without some emotion that the colonists watched it disappear in the misty west. "Where is he going to?" asked Pencroft. "Towards New Zealand," replied Herbert. "A good voyage to you," shouted the sailor, who himself did not expect any great result from this mode of correspondence. With the winter, work had been resumed in the interior of Granite House, mending clothes and different occupations, among others making the sails for their vessel, which were cut from the inexhaustible balloon case. During the month of July, the cold was intense, but there was no lack of either wood or coal. Cyrus Harding had established a second fireplace in the dining room, and there the long winter evenings were spent. Talking while they worked, reading when the hands remained idle, the time passed with profit to all. It was a real enjoyment to the settlers when in their room, well lighted with candles, well warmed with coal, after a good dinner, elderberry coffee smoking in the cups, the pipes giving forth an odoriferous smoke, they could hear the storm howling without. Their comfort would have been complete, if complete comfort could ever exist for those who are far from their fellow creatures, and without any means of communication with them. They often talked of their country, of the friends whom they had left, of the grandeur of the American Republic, whose influence could not but increase, and Cyrus Harding, who had been much mixed up with the affairs of the Union, greatly interested his auditors by his recitals, his views, and his prognostics. It chanced one day that Spilett was led to say, "But now, my dear Cyrus, all this industrial and commercial movement to which you predict a continual advance, does it not run the danger of being sooner or later completely stopped?" "Stopped? And by what?" "By the want of coal, which may justly be called the most precious of minerals." "Yes, the most precious indeed," replied the engineer, "and it would seem that nature wished to prove that it was so by making the diamond, which is simply pure carbon, crystallized." "You don't mean to say, Captain," interrupted Pencroft, "that we'll burn diamonds in our stoves in the shape of coal?" "No, my friend," replied Harding. "However," resumed Gideon Spilett, "you do not deny that some day the coal will be entirely consumed?" "Oh, the veins of coal are still considerable, and the 100,000 miners who annually extract from the 100 millions of hundredweights have not nearly exhausted them." "With the increasing consumption of coal," replied Gideon Spilett, "it can be foreseen that the 100,000 workmen will soon become 200,000, and that the rate of extraction will be doubled." "Doubtless, but after the European mines, which will be soon worked more thoroughly with new machines, the American and Australian mines will for a long time yet provide for the consumption in trade." "For how long a time?" asked the reporter. "For at least 250 or 300 years. That is reassuring for us, but a bad lookout for our great-grandchildren," observed Pencroft. "They will discover something else," said Herbert. "It is to be hoped so," answered Spilett. "For without coal there would be no machinery, and without machinery there would be no railways, no steamers, no manufactories, nothing of that which is indispensable to modern civilization." "But what will they find?" asked Pencroft. "Can you guess, Captain?" "Nearly, my friend." "And what will they burn instead of coal?" "Water," replied Harding. "Water!" cried Pencroft. "Water as fuel for steamers and engines? Water to heat water?" "Yes, but water decomposed into its primitive elements," replied Cyrus Harding, "and decomposed doubtless by electricity, which will then have become a powerful and manageable force, for all great discoveries by some inexplicable laws appear to agree and become complete at the same time. Yes, my friends, I believe that water will one day be employed as fuel, that hydrogen and oxygen, which constitute it, used singly or together, will furnish an inexhaustible source of heat and light, of an intensity of which coal is not capable. Some day the coal rooms of steamers and the tenders of locomotives will, instead of coal, be stored with these two condensed gases, which will burn in the furnaces with enormous calorific power. There is therefore nothing to fear. As long as the earth is inhabited, will supply the wants of its inhabitants, and there will be no want of either light or heat, as long as the productions of the vegetable, mineral, or animal kingdoms do not fail us. I believe, then, that when the deposits of coal are exhausted, we shall heat and warm ourselves with water. Water will be the coal of the future. I should like to see that, observed the sailor. You were born too soon, Pencroft, returned Neb, who only took part in the discussion by these words. However, it was not Neb's speech which interrupted the conversation, but Top's barking, which broke out again with that strange intonation which had before perplexed the engineer. At the same time, Top began to run round the mouth of the well, which opened at the extremity of the interior passage. "What can Top be barking in that way for?" asked Pencroft. "And Jupe be growling like that," added Herbert. In fact, the orang, joining the dog, gave unequivocal signs of agitation, and, singular to say, the two animals appeared more uneasy than angry. "It is evident," said Gideon Spilett, "that this well is in direct communication with the sea, and that some marine animal comes from time to time to breathe at the bottom." "That's evident," replied the sailor, "and there could be no other explanation to give. Quiet there, Top," added Pencroft, turning to the dog. "And you, Jup, be off to your room." The ape and the dog were silent. Jup went off to bed, but Top remained in the room and continued to utter low growls at intervals during the rest of the evening. There was no further talk on the subject, but the incident, however, clouded the brow of the engineer. During the remainder of the month of July, there was alternate rain and frost. The temperature was not so low as during the preceding winter, and its maximum did not exceed 8 degrees Fahrenheit. But although this winter was less cold, it was more troubled by storms and squalls. The sea, besides, often endangered the safety of the chimneys. At times it almost seemed as if an undercurrent raised these monstrous billows which thundered against the wall of Granite House. When the settlers, leaning from their windows, gazed on the huge watery masses breaking beneath their eyes, they could not but admire the magnificent spectacle of the ocean in its impotent fury. The waves rebounded in dazzling foam, the beach entirely disappearing under the raging flood, and the cliff appearing to emerge from the sea itself, the spray rising to a height of more than 100 feet. During these storms it was difficult and even dangerous to venture out, owing to the frequently falling trees. However, the colonists never allowed a week to pass without having paid a visit to the corral. Happily, this enclosure, sheltered by the southeastern spur of Mount Franklin, did not greatly suffer from the violence of the hurricanes, which spared its trees, sheds, and palisades, but the poultry yard on Prospect Heights, being directly exposed to the gusts of wind from the east, suffered considerable damage. The pigeon house was twice unroofed and the paling blown down. All this required to be remade more solidly than before, for, as may be clearly seen, Lincoln Island was situated in one of the most dangerous parts of the Pacific. It really appeared as if it formed the central point of vast cyclones, which beat it perpetually as the whip does the top, only here it was the top which was motionless and the whip which moved. During the first week of the month of August, the weather became more moderate, and the atmosphere recovered the calm which it appeared to have lost forever. With the calm, the cold again became intense, and the thermometer fell to 8 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. On the 3rd of August, an excursion which had been talked of for several days was made into the southeastern part of the island, towards Tadorn Marsh. The hunters were tempted by the aquatic game which took up their winter quarters there. Wild duck, snipe, teal, and grebe abounded there, and it was agreed that a day should be devoted to an expedition against these birds. Not only Gideon Spilett and Herbert, but Pencroft and Neb also took part of this excursion. Cyrus Harding alone, alleging some work as an excuse, did not join them, but remained at Granite House. The hunters proceeded in the direction of Port Balloon in order to reach the marsh, after having promised to be back by the evening. Top and Jupe accompanied them. As soon as they had passed over the Mercy Bridge, the engineer raised it and returned, intending to put into execution a project for the performance of which he wished to be alone. Now, this project was to minutely explore the interior well, the mouth of which was on a level with the passage of Granite House, and which communicated with the sea, since it formerly supplied a way to the waters of the lake. Why did Top so often run round this opening? Why did he utter such strange barks when a sort of uneasiness seemed to draw him towards this well? Why did Jupe join Top in a sort of common anxiety? Had this well branches beside the communication with the sea? Did it spread towards other parts of the island? This is what Cyrus Harding wished to know. He had resolved, therefore, to attempt the exploration of the well during the absence of his companions, and an opportunity for doing so had now presented itself. It was easy to descend to the bottom of the well by employing the rope ladder, which had not been used since the establishment of the lift. The engineer drew the ladder to the hole, the diameter of which measured nearly 6 feet, and allowed it to unroll itself after having securely fastened its upper extremity. Then, having lighted a lantern, taken a revolver, and placed a cutlass in his belt, he began the descent. The sides were everywhere entire, but points of rock jutted out here and there, and by means of these points it would have been quite possible for an active creature to climb to the mouth of the well. The engineer remarked this, but although he carefully examined these points by the light of his lantern, he could find no impression, no fracture which would give any reason to suppose that they had either recently or at any former time been used as a staircase. Cyrus Harding descended deeper, throwing the light of his lantern on all sides. He saw nothing suspicious. When the engineer had reached the last rounds, he came upon the water, which was then perfectly calm. Neither at its level nor in any other part of the well did any passage open which could lead to the interior of the cliff. The wall which Harding struck with the hilt of his cutlass sounded solid. It was compact granite, through which no living being could force a way. To arrive at the bottom of the well and then climb up to its mouth, it was necessary to pass through the channel under the rocky subsoil of the beach, which placed it in communication with the sea, and this was only possible for marine animals. As to the question of knowing where this channel ended, at what point of the shore, and at what depth beneath the water, it could not be answered. Then Cyrus Harding, having ended his survey, reascended, drew up the ladder, covered the mouth of the well, and returned thoughtfully to the dining room, saying to himself, "I have seen nothing, and yet there is something there." End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. In the evening the hunters returned, having enjoyed good sport, and being literally loaded with game. Indeed, they had as much as 4 men could possibly carry. Top wore a necklace of teal, and Jupe wreaths of snipe round his body. "Here, master," cried Neb, "here's something to employ our time. Preserved and made into pies, we shall have a welcome store. But I must have someone to help me. I count on you, Pencroft." "No, Neb," replied the sailor. "I have the rigging of the vessel to finish and to look after, and you will have to do without me." "And you, Mr. Herbert?" "I must go to the corral tomorrow, Neb," replied the lad. "It will be you then, Mr. Spilett, who will help me?" "To oblige you, Neb, I will," replied the reporter. "But I warn you that if you disclose your recipes to me, I shall publish them." "Whenever you like, Mr. Spilett," replied Neb. "Whenever you like." And so the next day Gideon Spilett became Neb's assistant and was installed in his culinary laboratory. The engineer had previously made known to him the result of the exploration which he had made the day before, and on this point the reporter shared Harding's opinion, that although he had found nothing, a secret still remained to be discovered. The frost continued for another week, and the settlers did not leave Granite House unless to look after the poultry yard. The dwelling was filled with appetizing odors, which were emitted from the learned manipulation of Neb and the reporter. But all the results of the chase were not made into preserved provisions, and as the game kept perfectly in the intense cold, wild duck and other fowl were eaten fresh, and declared superior to all other aquatic birds in the known world. During this week, Pencroft, aided by Herbert, who handled the sailmaker's needle with much skill, worked with such energy that the sails of the vessel were finished. There was no want of cordage, thanks to the rigging which had been discovered with the case of the balloon. The ropes and cables from the net were all of good quality, and the sailor turned them all to account. To the sailors were attached strong bolt ropes, and there still remained enough from which to make the halyards, shrouds, and sheets, etc. The blocks were manufactured by Cyrus Harding under Pencroft's direction by means of the turning lathe. It therefore happened that the rigging was entirely prepared before the vessel was finished. Pencroft also manufactured a flag, that flag so dear to every true American, containing the stars and stripes of their glorious Union. The colors for it were supplied from certain plants used in dyeing, and which were very abundant in the island. Only to the 37 stars representing the 37 states of the Union, which shine on the American flag, the sailor added a 38th, the star of the state of Lincoln, for he considered his island as already united to the great republic. And, said he, it is so already in heart, if not in deed. In the meantime, the flag was hoisted at the central window of Granite House, and the settlers saluted it with 3 cheers. The cold season was now almost at an end, and it appeared as if this second winter was to pass without any unusual occurrence, when, on the night of the 11th of August, the plateau of Prospect Heights was menaced with complete destruction. After a busy day, the colonists were sleeping soundly when, towards 4 o'clock in the morning, they were suddenly awakened by Top's barking. The dog was not this time barking near the mouth of the well, but at the threshold of the door, at which he was scratching as if he wished to burst it open. Jup was also uttering piercing cries. "Hello, Top!" cried Neb, who was the first to wake, but the dog continued to bark more furiously than ever. "What's the matter now?" asked Harding, and all dressing in haste rushed to the windows, which they opened. Beneath their eyes was spread a sheet of snow which looked gray in the dim light. The settlers could see nothing, but they heard a singular yelping noise away in the darkness. It was evident that the beach had been invaded by a number of animals which could not be seen. "What are they?" cried Pencroft. "Wolves, jaguars, or apes," replied Neb. "They've nearly reached the plateau," said the reporter. "And our poultry yard," exclaimed Herbert, "and our garden." "Where can they have crossed?" asked Pencroft. "They must have crossed the bridge on the shore," replied the engineer, "which one of us must have forgotten to close." "True," said Spilett. "I remember having left it open." "A fine job you've made of it, Mr. Spilett," cried the sailor. "What is done cannot be undone," replied Cyrus Harding. "We must consult what it will now be best to do." Such were the questions and answers which were rapidly exchanged between Harding and his companions. It was certain that the bridge had been crossed, that the shore had been invaded by animals, and that whatever they might be, they could be ascending the left bank of the Mercy and reach Prospect Heights. They must therefore be advanced against quickly and fought with if necessary. "But what are these beasts?" was asked a second time, as the yelpings were again heard more loudly than before. These yelps made Herbert start, and he remembered having heard them before during his first visit to the sources of the Red Creek. "They are colpio foxes," he exclaimed. "Forward!" shouted the sailor. And all arming themselves with hatchets, carbines, and revolvers, threw themselves into the lift and soon set foot on the shore. Colpios are dangerous animals when in great numbers and irritated by hunger. Nevertheless, the colonists did not hesitate to throw themselves into the midst of the troop, and their first shots vividly lighting up the darkness made their assailants draw back. The chief thing was to hinder these plunderers from reaching the plateau, for the garden and the poultry yard would then have been at their mercy, and immense, perhaps irreparable mischief would inevitably be the result, especially with regard to the cornfield. But as the invasion of the plateau could only be made by the left bank of the Mersey, it was sufficient to oppose the Colpios on the narrow bank between the river and the cliff of granite. This was plain to all, and by Cyrus Harding's orders they reached the spot indicated by him, while the Colpios rushed fiercely through the gloom. Harding, Gideon Spilett, Herbert, Pencroft, and Neb posted themselves in an impregnable line. Top, his formidable jaws open, preceded the colonists, and he was followed by Jup, armed with a knotty cudgel which he brandished like a club. The night was extremely dark. It was only by the flashes from the revolvers as each person fired that they could see their assailants, who were at least 100 in number, and whose eyes were glowing like hot coals. "They must not pass," shouted Pencroft. "They shall not pass," returned the engineer. But if they did not pass, it was not for want of having attempted it. Those in the rear pushed on the foremost assailants, and it was an incessant struggle with revolvers and hatchets. Several Colpios already lay dead on the ground, but their number did not appear to diminish, and it might have been supposed that reinforcements were continually arriving over the bridge. The colonists were soon obliged to fight at close quarters, not without receiving some wounds, though happily very slight ones. Herbert had, with a shot from his revolver, rescued Neb, on whose back a Colpio had sprung like a tiger cat. Top fought with actual fury, flying at the throats of the foxes and strangling them instantaneously. Jup wielded his weapon valiantly, and it was in vain that they endeavored to keep him in the rear. Endowed doubtless with sight which enabled him to pierce the obscurity, he was always in the thick of the fighting, uttering from time to time a sharp hissing sound, which was with him the sign of great rejoicing. At one moment he advanced so far that by the light from a revolver he was seen surrounded by 5 or 6 large Colpios, with whom he was coping with great coolness. However, the struggle was ended at last, and victory was on the side of the settlers, but not until they had fought for 2 long hours. The first signs of the approach of day doubtless determined the retreat of their assailants, who scampered away towards the north, passing over the bridge, which Neb ran immediately to raise. When day had sufficiently lighted up the field of battle, the settlers counted as many as 50 dead bodies scattered about on the shore. "And Jup!" cried Pencroft. "Where's Jup?" Jup had disappeared. His friend Neb called him, and for the first time Jup did not reply to his friend's call. Everyone set out in search of Jup, trembling lest he should be found among the slain. They cleared the place of the bodies which stained the snow with their blood. Jup was found in the midst of a heap of Colpios whose broken jaws and crushed bodies showed that they had had to do with the terrible club of the intrepid animal. Poor Jup still held in his hand the stump of his broken cudgel, but deprived of his weapon he had been overpowered by numbers, and his chest was covered with severe wounds. "He is living," cried Neb, who was bending over him. "And we will save him," replied the sailor. "We will nurse him as if he was one of ourselves." It appeared as if Jup understood, for he leaned his head on Pencroft's shoulder as if to thank him. The sailor was wounded himself, but his wound was insignificant, as were those of his companions, for thanks to their firearms they had been almost always able to keep their assailants at a distance. It was therefore only the orang whose condition was serious. Jup, carried by Neb and Pencroft, was placed in the lift, and only a slight moan now and then escaped his lips. He was gently drawn up to Granite House. There he was laid on a mattress taken from one of the beds, and his wounds were bathed with the greatest care. It did not appear that any vital part had been reached, but Jup was very weak from loss of blood, and a high fever soon set in after his wounds had been dressed. He was laid down, strict diet was imposed, just like a real person, as Neb said, and they made him swallow several cups of a cooling drink, for which the ingredients were supplied from the vegetable medicine chest of Granite House. Jupe was at first restless, but his breathing gradually became more regular, and he was less sleeping quietly. From time to time, Top, walking on tiptoe, as one might say, came to visit his friend, and seemed to approve of all the care that had been taken of him. One of Jupe's hands hung over the side of his bed, and Top licked it with a sympathizing air. They employed the day in interring the dead, who were dragged to the forest of the far west, and there buried deep. This attack, which might have had such serious consequences, was a lesson to the settlers, who from this time never went to bed until one of their number had made sure that all the bridges were raised, and that no invasion was possible. However, Jupe, after having given them serious anxiety for several days, began to recover. His constitution brought him through, the fever gradually subsided, and Gideon Spilett, who was a bit of a doctor, pronounced him quite out of danger. On the 16th of August, Jupe began to eat. Neb made him nice little sweet dishes, which the invalid devoured with great relish, for if he had a pet failing, it was that of being somewhat of a gourmand, and Neb had never done anything to cure him of this fault. "What would you have?" said he to Gideon Spilett, who sometimes expostulated with him for spoiling the ape. "Poor Jupe has no other pleasure than that of the palate, and I am only too glad to be able to reward his services in this way." 10 days after taking to his bed on the 21st of August, Master Jupe arose. His wounds were healed, and it was evident that he would not be long in regaining his usual strength and agility. Like all convalescents, he was tremendously hungry, and the reporter allowed him to eat as much as he liked, for he trusted to that instinct which is too often wanting in reasoning beings to keep the orang from any excess. Neb was delighted to see his pupil's appetite returning. "Eat away, my Jupe," said he, "and don't spare anything. You have shed your blood for us, and it's the least I can do to make you strong again." On the 25th of August, Neb's voice was heard calling to his companions. "Captain! Mr. Spilett! Mr. Herbert! Pencroft, come! Come!" The colonists, who were together in the dining room, rose at Neb's call, who was then in Jupe's room. "What's the matter?" asked the reporter. "Look!" replied Neb with a shout of laughter, and what did they see? Master Jupe, smoking calmly and seriously, sitting cross-legged like a Turk at the entrance to Granite House. "My pipe!" cried Pencroft. "He has taken my pipe! Hello, my honest Jupe! I make you a present of it. Smoke away, old boy, smoke away." And Jupe gravely puffed out clouds of smoke, which seemed to give him great satisfaction. Hardy did not appear to be much astonished at this incident, and he cited several examples of tame apes to whom the use of tobacco had become quite familiar. But from this day Master Jupe had a pipe of his own, the sailor's ex-pipe, which was hung in his room near his store of tobacco. He filled it himself, lighted it with a glowing coal, and appeared to be the happiest of quadrumana. It may readily be understood that this similarity of tastes of Jupe and Pencroft served to tighten the bonds of friendship which already existed between the honest ape and the worthy sailor. "Perhaps he's really a man," said Pencroft sometimes to Neb. "Should you be surprised to hear him beginning to speak to us some day?" "My word, no," replied Neb. "What astonishes me is that he hasn't spoken to us before, for now he wants nothing but speech." "It would amuse me all the same," resumed the sailor, "if some fine day he said to me, 'Suppose we change pipes, Pencroft?'" "Yes," replied Neb. "What a pity he was born dumb." With the month of September the winter ended, and the works were again eagerly commenced. The building of the vessel advanced rapidly. She was already completely decked over, and all the inside parts of the hull were firmly united with ribs bent by means of steam, which answered all the purposes of a mold. As there was no want of wood, Pencroft proposed to the engineer to give a double lining to the hull to ensure the strength of the vessel. Harding, not knowing what the future might have in store for them, approved the sailor's idea of making the craft as strong as possible. The interior and deck of the vessel was entirely finished towards the 15th of September. For caulking the seams, they made oakum of dry seaweed, which was hammered in between the planks. Then these seams were covered with boiling tar, which was obtained in great abundance from the pines of the forest. The management of the vessel was very simple. She had from the first been ballasted with heavy blocks of granite walled up in a bed of lime, 12,000 pounds of which they stowed away. A deck was placed over this ballast, and the interior was divided into 2 cabins. 2 benches extended along them and served also as lockers. The foot of the mast supported the partition which separated the 2 cabins, which were reached by 2 hatchways let into the deck. Pencroft had no trouble in finding a tree suitable for the mast. He chose a straight young fir with no knots, and which he had only to square at the step and round off at the top. The ironwork of the mast, the rudder, and the hull had been roughly but strongly forged at the chimneys. Lastly, yards, masts, booms, spars, oars, etc., were all furnished by the first week in October, and it was agreed that a trial trip should be taken round the island, so as to ascertain how the vessel would behave at sea, and how far they might depend upon her. During all this time the necessary works had not been neglected. The corral was enlarged, for the flock of musmons and goats had been increased by a number of young ones who had to be housed and fed. The colonists had paid visits also to the oyster bed, the warren, the coal and iron mines, and to the till then unexplored districts of the far west forest, which abounded in game. Certain indigenous plants were discovered, and those fit for immediate use contributed to vary the vegetables stored at Granite House. They were a species of Fucoideae, some similar to those of the Cape, with eatable fleshy leaves, others bearing seeds containing a sort of flower. On the 10th of October the vessel was launched. Pencroft was radiant with joy. The operation was perfectly successful. The boat, completely rigged, having been pushed on rollers to the water's edge, was floated by the rising tide amid the cheers of the colonists, particularly of Pencroft, who showed no modesty on this occasion. Besides, his importance was to last beyond the finishing of the vessel, since, after having built her, he was to command her. The grade of captain was bestowed upon him with the approbation of all. To satisfy Captain Pencroft, it was now necessary to give a name to the vessel, and after many propositions had been discussed, the votes were all in favor of the Bonadventure. As soon as the Bonadventure had been lifted by the rising tide, it was seen that she lay evenly in the water and would be easily navigated. However, the trial trip was to be made that very day by an excursion off the coast. The weather was fine, the breeze fresh, and the sea smooth, especially towards the south coast, for the wind was blowing from the northwest. "All hands on board!" shouted Pencroft. But breakfast was first necessary, and it was thought best to take provisions on board in the event of their excursion being prolonged until the evening. Cyrus Harding was equally anxious to try the vessel, the model of which had originated with him, although on the sailor's advice he had altered some parts of it. But he did not share Pencroft's confidence in her, and as the latter had not again spoken of the voyage to Tabor Island, Harding hoped he had given it up. He would have indeed great reluctance in letting 2 or 3 of his companions venture so far in so small a boat, which was not of more than 15 tons burden. At 10:30, everybody was on board, even Top and Jupe, and Herbert weighed the anchor, which was fast in the sand near the mouth of the Mercy. The sail was hoisted, the Lincolnian flag floated from the masthead, and the Bonadventure, steered by Pencroft, stood out to sea. The wind blowing out of Union Bay, she ran before it, and thus showed her owners, much to their satisfaction, that she possessed a remarkably fast pair of heels, according to Pencroft's mode of speaking. After having doubled Flotsam Point and Claw Cape, the captain kept her close hauled, so as to sail along the southern coast of the island. When it was found, she sailed admirably within 5 points of the wind. All hands were enchanted. They had a good vessel, which in case of a need would be of great service to them, and with fine weather and a fresh breeze, the voyage promised to be charming. Pencroft now stood off the shore 3 or 4 miles across from Port Balloon. The island then appeared in all its extent and under a new aspect, with the varied panorama of its shore from Claw Cape to Reptile End, the forests in which dark firs contrasted with the young foliage of other trees and overlooked the whole, and Mount Franklin, whose lofty head was still whitened with snow. "How beautiful it is!" cried Herbert. "Yes, our island is beautiful and good," replied Pencroft. "I love it as I love my poor mother. It received us poor and destitute, and now what is wanted to us 5 fellows who fell on it from the sky?" "Nothing," replied Neb. "Nothing, Captain." And the 2 brave men gave 3 tremendous cheers in honor of their island. During all this time, Gideon Spilett, leaning against the mast, sketched the panorama which was developed before his eyes. Cyrus Harding gazed on it in silence. "Well, Captain Harding," asked Pencroft, "what do you think of our vessel?" "She appears to behave well," replied the engineer. "Good. And do you think now that you could undertake a voyage of some extent?" "What voyage, Pencroft?" "One to Tabor Island, for instance." "My friend," replied Harding, "I think that in any pressing emergency we need not hesitate to trust ourselves to the Bonadventure, even for a longer voyage. But you know I should see you set off to Tabor Island with great uneasiness, since nothing obliges you to go there." "One likes to know one's neighbors," returned the sailor, who was obstinate in his idea. "Tabor Island is our neighbor, and the only one. Politeness requires us to go at least to pay a visit." "By Jove," said Spilett, "our friend Pencroft has become very particular about the proprieties all at once." "I'm not particular about anything at all," retorted the sailor, who was rather vexed by the engineer's opposition, but who did not wish to cause him anxiety. "Consider, Pencroft," resumed Harding, "you cannot go alone to Tabor Island." "One companion will be enough for me." "Even so," replied the engineer, "you will risk depriving the colony of Lincoln Island of 2 settlers out of 5. "Out of 6, answered Pencroft. "You forgot Jupe." "Out of 7, added Neb. "Top is quite worth another." "There's no risk at all in it, Captain," replied Pencroft. "That is possible, Pencroft. But I repeat, it is to expose ourselves uselessly." The obstinate sailor did not reply, and let the conversation drop, quite determined to resume it again. But he did not suspect that an incident would come to his aid and change into an act of humanity that which was at first only a doubtful whim. After standing off the shore, the Bonadventure again approached it in the direction of Port Balloon. It was important to ascertain the channels between the sandbanks and reefs, that buoys might be laid down, since this little creek was to be the harbor. They were not more than half a mile from the coast, and it was necessary to tack to beat against the wind. The Bonadventure was then going at a very moderate rate, as the breeze, partly intercepted by the high land, scarcely swelled her sails, and the sea, smooth as glass, was only rippled now and then by passing gusts. Herbert had stationed himself in the bow that he might indicate the course to be followed among the channels, when all at once he shouted, "Luff, Pencroft, luff!" "What's the matter?" replied the sailor. "A rock?" "No, wait," said Herbert. "I don't quite see. Luff again, right now." So saying, Herbert, leaning over the side, plunged his arm into the water and pulled it out, exclaiming, "A bottle!" He held in his hand a corked bottle which he had just seized a few cables' length from the shore. Cyrus Harding took the bottle. Without uttering a single word, he drew the cork, and took from it a damp paper, on which were written these words: "Castaway, Tabor Island, 153 degrees west longitude, 37 degrees 11 minutes south latitude." End of chapter 12. Well, they're still alive. Let's see what happens next, shall we? If you've enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to hit the like and subscribe, smash that bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. Good night now.